I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about Margaret Rood and her approach. This was one of our objectives for the week, and the textbook doesn't uses or weaves in Rood's approach, particularly Umfred, but it does not specifically cite Dr. Rood's sequence of motor development, or Margaret Rood's, which is objective 2 for the week. So if you recall from PTA 100, Margaret Rood was a physiotherapist from the 1940s. So what she proposed in the 1940s still has application today in terms of her approach to development and sequencing of specific postures or positioning from starting out in, for example, side lying, and then over time progressing to standing. So what she proposed, I think she was way ahead of her time, and she may not have had the science to really talk about why her sequencing was such. But it's still used today widely in therapy, even though when she developed it, there wasn't that evidence to back what she was saying. But the first underlying principle for Rood is the normalization of tone, and this makes sense. If someone's in real high tone and it prevents them from moving spasticity, you'll want to at least reduce the tone. Now, we do know that sometimes tone can be quite functional, so we have to keep that in mind. But overall, if someone's in very high tone because of a upper motor neuron problem, you do want to reduce some of that tone to allow movement. And you can use the appropriate stimuli for evoking the desired response. So stroking, for example, if someone is low tone, you would use to improve tone or to increase tone as one way, or joint approximation as you've learned in lab. So kind of going back, motor control is developmentally based. So according to Rood, you must assess current level of development and then try the next higher levels of control. So in other words, before advancing someone to quadruped, pronon elbows would be first. Okay, so kind of going down to this sequencing, rolling over, which would be part of going into supine to side lying, being able to pivot prone, that's movement in prone, that neck co-contraction, you need some muscular tone with the head, controlling the head, cephalad part of the body, in order to move. And then the next sequencing would be that prone on elbow, being able to move on your elbows, and then going on to quadruped. And then, in the next step, she doesn't explicitly state it, but it would be kind of that bear crawling, as I call it, on your feet and on your hands with your bottom up in the air. And then you have modified plantigrade, and then you have standing, and then walking. And you need to incorporate some purposeful activities to get the desired result, and that makes sense with really anybody. I think certainly there has to be, a connection as to why this movement is needed, right, in order to get someone to participate. And repetition of movement. And that's similar to really the NDT approach when you think about it. Repetition of movement in order to get better at movement. And similarly, which I thought was quite beautiful, is that in 104 Lab with Susan and myself and Christina last year, we really learned about the principles of mobility, movement and of extremities, trunk, and then you incorporate stability, using those agonists and antagonists. We're going to stabilize and maintain the position of the body. Bridging certainly could be an example of that. and stability in quadruped. Mobility is superimposed on stability, so once you're stable proximally, you can later do other things, right? If you have that stability, then you can move on top of that stability. And then finally, that distal movement of hands and feet, extremities, on top of proximal stability, which would be, your core. So that's Rude in a nutshell. A person way ahead of her time, going back to the 1940s. But when you see Rude sequencing, this will be your reference point to help you be able to build on her approach and to utilize her approach when you're working with children, and really working with adults too, with central nervous system insult, as well as looking at orthopedics, right? You've learned how you're utilizing really a Rude approach too when you're working in terms of strengthening someone with an orthopedic challenge, as you did last spring. But in this case, we're looking at working with someone with a neurological health condition.